Welcome back aboard Titanic, everyone. We are now in the crew spaces forward, which covers a lot of the various employees of White Star Line that served aboard that weren't deck officers. At the moment, we're standing pretty much as far forward as you can go and still be on the ship. As you can see, this is the hawse-pipe here. The very prow, if I crouch a little bit, you can see through this opening, and there's a very high tension cable that's currently feeding out through it, but we're as far forward as you can go. In the windlass space, this is directly beneath the forecastle, the raised forecastle at the very forward part of the ship, the white painted band near the front that is somewhat elevated from the well deck immediately aft of it, and this includes all sorts of various machinery necessary for operating a ship of this size. Titanic, at least forward, carried 3 anchors, 2 mounted on either side and 1 along the center line, and they were enormously heavy, on the order of a ton or 2 apiece. And in order to move those, you need a lot of heavy equipment. And the windlasses, which are sort of the round things that you see a lot of the time on deck spaces on ships of all types, those are intended to crank either some of these cables or the giant anchor chains around and around to either raise or lower the anchor. And you can't do that with people. It would be far too heavy. So Titanic's anchors in particular, at least, had mini reciprocating steam engines to do some of that lifting. There was extra steam from elsewhere in the engineering spaces downstairs that would come up into this windlass space and be geared down dramatically, as you can see, with all of these various connecting angular gears. And eventually, these engines, and there are multiple of them, I believe 4 in this space, would eventually function to either turn this horizontal windlass or the giant steam-powered windlasses upstairs, and the crankshafts for those you can see passing directly through here. So this is a very mechanical space. This was used primarily by the actual deckhands, sailors, the true mariner department on board. There's some fans and things in here as well. And then there's actually 2 cabins on either side in this space for 2 various crew members each. I don't remember precisely who was bunked in here. I know one of the lamp trimmers was in one of these, probably this one. See the ocean through some of these openings here. These you could pass mooring lines through to tie up to a dock. Not that, that's just a porthole. Moving aft through this gated section, though, we can head into the more livable parts of the ship. As you can see, we have the number 1 cargo hatch removed, so you can see the sky. The crow's nest is up there, perhaps just a little bit of the bridge front, depending on how well, no. You can see the number 1 funnel, though, belching smoke up there. And one of the things that you get this far forward is the ship's shear. As we slope upwards towards the very bow of the ship, the entire floor slants, as you can see from that wall there. And one thing that I forgot, I just remembered that I've forgotten it. All of the chain that, oh, excuse me. This is not the chain locker. This is the peak tank storage rooms. From D-deck down, things that weren't necessary to be stored anywhere else, in the cargo holds, baggage rooms, or galley stores, or whatever you may need, they could be put up here in this otherwise unusable triangular space near the very, very bow of the ship. And there were storerooms like this going all the way down to the tank top on each deck level. The only way you can get to them is through these hatches. There's no doors, so you'd have to climb, but this was sort of excess space that they wouldn't have any other use for besides storing random things. I don't know what's in these sacks. Definitely doesn't need to be climate controlled though, because it would get kind of musty in here. It's a locker of some sort. Climb back out of here. Further aft, though, there's a couple of rather interesting spaces. What we have here is a sailor's mess. Various crew departments had their own mess halls, and this one was for deckhands and sailors. It's not a particularly large one because compared to some of the other departments on board, weren't a whole lot of sailors on board Titanic. There were some, and they wouldn't necessarily all eat at once either, so the room's size is somewhat deceiving, but this would have been where they would eat. There is a mess hall, or two mess halls, on the other side, on the starboard side, for, I believe, firemen and trimmers, so the men from the boiler rooms. And those two mess halls are larger, put together, than the one for the sailors over here. You can just barely see, we've got daylight pouring down into the number 1 cargo hold. And you can also see how there's openings at each deck level so that if something needed to be offloaded at F deck for some reason, that could be done. So a shipment of a large amount of soap for third-class accommodation could just be brought down and immediately arrive roughly at its destination and distributed to the various public bathrooms. Stairs down to C deck, or D deck, excuse me, we're on C deck. This is the crew's galley. So not every crew department would be serviced through here. I think the officers probably received their meals from either the first or second class staff, galley staff, but this is sort of a small galley that services all of the crew that would eat up here under the forecastle, so those 3 mess halls I mentioned earlier. All of the ranges and ovens here are coal-fired, as you can see. We have some of the fires burning here. Some soup pots are up on the ranges, and one of the burners here is removed, so you can kind of see inside and how that would have functioned. There's a loaf of bread in there in the oven. And they've got stuff laid out here so that the ship definitely appears lived in and in use. Fresh loaf of bread there. And a single cucumber for some reason. Everybody loves cheese. Got a sink. And then this shows just how much coffee was consumed on board, especially by the crew. You got to keep your energy up. But these are giant boilers to heat water for coffee, and then that's a sack of coffee right there. And then this weird looking machine, that's a potato peeler. Titanic had a potato room. We may be able to see that later. It was a room full of potatoes. She carried about 4 tons, and I did the math. That equates to roughly 0.06% of Titanic's entire gross registered tonnage of about 46,000 tons was potatoes. But it does make sense when you remember that they need to have potatoes for 2,200 people for probably at least a week, and some margin of error in case they end up on board longer. And then I assume, since this is right here, that's probably a garbage chute. I don't know that for certain, but I don't know what else you would need this weird bucket hatch chute thing for. More ovens. Got some dishes all laid out here. These are ginormous soup pots when you actually take a look at the size of that. This hatch would go to the well deck, but because they split the game into multiple levels to prevent overloading GPUs and things, and the well deck and the forecastle deck neither of those spaces are available yet. You can see them, but you can't walk there. They have a jump cut directly to the first class promenade, which is actually over 100 feet away, but this works. I'm not going to go there yet. And over here is something that's... Let me see if I can actually get through the door there. You may be thinking, what is this weird tube? And why is there a hatch in it? With a ladder? Well, if you remember the foremast that we saw from the bridge in yesterday's tour, had a crow's nest partway up it. Well, now, we can actually go to the crow's nest. And I may be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure this is our first loading screen. There are multiple loading screens throughout the ship, but they don't take particularly long, so as you can see, that was pretty quick. We're now on the crow's nest, and we have this nice view aft of the ship's bridge front, the various wedding cake stacked decks going on there, lifeboats and funnels moving aft. But generally, if you were up here with your telephone and your bell, you wouldn't be looking aft. It would be your job to be looking forward. And this was the perspective that the lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had on the night of April 14th, 15th, excuse me, 1912. Obviously, it was not daylight, but this was roughly how high they were. Now, there's some perpetual debate as to the series of events during the sighting of the iceberg and the evasive maneuvering conducted by the ship. As you can see, we're a little bit higher, a little bit more than a little bit, than the bridge, and Officer Murdoch was stationed for his watch on the starboard bridge wing, there on the left. So his line of sight was lower than the lookouts would have been. On the night that Titanic struck the iceberg, there was no moon. It was pitch black. There was no wind, so none of these white caps and nothing to break at the base of the iceberg. We also believe that weather conditions at the time created what's called a cold air mirage, where essentially the atmosphere warps perspective as to precisely where the horizon is. I don't know enough about climatology to properly describe how that functions, but all of these things work together to make it enormously difficult to see icebergs. Now, there was one way, and this was how the lookouts noticed that there was one, was there were stars out that night. So what they saw was not the iceberg, but a void in the line of stars, an absence of stars. So they knew there was something ahead of them. They just didn't know precisely what it was, but there was really only one thing it could be. And the moment they saw that, picked up the phone, called the bridge. I believe it was Officer Moody that picked up. What do you see? And either Lee or Fleet responded, iceberg right ahead. Moody thanks him before everyone on the bridge then begins executing hard to starboard and all stop. Now, the reason I bring any of this up is I'm using the perspective from the crow's nest here to point out that if what you were seeing wasn't the iceberg, but the absence of stars on the horizon, the lower you are, the sooner you're going to see that absence of stars on the horizon. So, it's not yet historical consensus, but a theory proposed is that Officer Murdoch on watch down on the bridge wing may have sighted the iceberg ahead of the lookouts, and there are some accounts that the ship was already turning, or in the process of putting the helm over, before the lookouts even picked up the phone, which would indicate that Murdoch had already given orders by the time the lookouts were realizing what was going on. Which would actually somewhat explain Moody's cursory thank you. He was already aware, but regardless, there was only 37 seconds from the moment they sighted the iceberg to the collision, so they didn't have a whole lot of time. Let's see if I can actually get back down here. There we go. Alright, I think we can move on down. I think either of these stairs functions for our purposes. I was wrong. There's a blockage. We'll have to use this set of stairs, I think. Yes, this is the one I needed. Okay, so this is the uppermost terminal point of the fireman's spiral staircase. So the firemen, who again would eat in their mess hall upstairs, were the men that were actually shoveling coal into the boilers, and the trimmers were the men that were bringing coal from the bunkers to the stokers to shovel into the boilers. And this was their passage from their living spaces, their bunk rooms and mess halls and things of that nature, down to where they actually worked. And this was as high as that staircase went, and then there were other stairs to get to various spots as well. As you can see, we've got sort of a nicer view of the number 1 cargo hold. We'll certainly get there. These would normally be covered with canvas, so that there couldn't be rain or daylight pouring down like there are now, but it is a nice day, so it seems as though they've opened it up in part to let light down. We can head down another deck level here, and there's a few interesting things to see on this deck. We go around the number 1 hatch. We can go a bit forward, and in here is a trimmer's bunk room, which, as you can see, is very tight. It's very cramped quarters. You can see the ship's sheer as we lean upwards towards the prow. These weird shaped boxes, those are their lockers for their personal effects and things, and as you can see, there's not a whole lot of personal space at all. And the center anchor sits pretty much directly above us. So the chains for the 2 side anchors, and indeed the center anchor, pass through these tubes, which means I wouldn't really want this bunk, either of these bunks or the ones on the other side, because in the event that we needed to drop anchor in the middle of the night or something, the chains would be passing within like a foot or so of your head, which would not be a quiet experience by any means. So that would not be fun. And down here is the chain locker. So the terminal point of those tubes, where the chains pass through, they feed into this locker here. And as you can see, the port one is let almost all the way out, and the starboard one is brought almost all the way in. This would not be a space where you would normally have people, but obviously there's some lights and a ladder to get in here in the event that there's some necessary mechanical work that needs to be done. But this would normally be a rather inhospitable place. And you can see how you could very easily end up trapped in here and crushed if something went terribly wrong. But that's why predominantly... Whoops, I fell. This hatch would be closed and latched, so that somebody getting out of bed in the morning didn't accidentally fall in there. Like I almost did right there. These bulkheads are all wood, and so they're not quite temporary walls per se, but they certainly wouldn't provide a whole lot of sound insulation. Or suppression, I guess you could say. Moving on down, we are now, I believe, in firemen's quarters. So this is the bunk room for the men actually handling the coal and getting it into the furnaces downstairs, which we'll see where they work here in a bit. But as you can see, this is an extremely tight environment, and while in all likelihood not all of these men would be sleeping all at once, it would still be a rather uncomfortably claustrophobic environment, and there's not a whole lot of space for personal effects. Plus lots of things to hit your head on. So that would be my concern. I'm not particularly spatially aware. We can head even further down here. Now, I believe I'm always confused by these signs. I think we're on G deck, but this could also mean that G deck is the deck below us. But regardless, we're going to head down here. Always go down ladders backwards to the number 1 cargo hold. So this is not passenger baggage. This is cargo that was shipped on board Titanic by various businesses. Generally, I think it was probably going to be set up in a more orderly fashion than this. This appears to be everything's piled down at the base of the cargo hatch to be organized later, almost as if we're on departure day, despite that I think this is supposed to be set on the 12th of April. But regardless, this is a very maze-like space, as you can tell. This is not the cargo hold where the car would have been. The Renault automobile that was shipped aboard Titanic that featured rather conspicuously in the movie. We think that it may have been crated up, though, in bits and not shipped whole, as you saw in the Cameron film. So it would be rather difficult to make use of the car in the same way that Jack and Rose did. I'm not sure about this. This is what appears to be pirate treasure. We have some Spanish gold, pieces of 8 and stuff in here, and some gems, and what is definitely not the Holy Grail. If you learn anything from Indiana Jones, it's don't drink out of the fancy gold cup, you'll melt. It's not the real one. Head back out of here. I don't know that there's necessarily anything else to see in this part of the ship. Let's see. Let's head back down another deck level. And by another deck level, I mean all the way down, because we are now heading into the stokehold. The actual workspace for the firemen and trimmers, etc. So, as you can see, there'd be this vestibule here at the very terminus of these stairs. You can sort of look up. No, not very far. I guess the stairs sort of block the view up. And then this is the fireman's tunnel. So this weirdly shaped space would take the firemen and trimmers from where they live upstairs to where they work in the extremely hot boiler rooms. So we're going to follow this tunnel here. This is actually not, well, it's sitting on top of the tank top. So this is not the bottom hull plating of the ship, but it's sitting on top of the bottom hull plating of the ship. So, or at least the top of the double bottom. The true bottom of the ship is like another 10 feet below that, but now we can head through this door here into the watertight vestibule into boiler room 6. Now, here is this sort of space. This is an example of how the watertight doors would work on board. This one is closed, and the one after that is open. So I can sort of show how this works. There's 2 ways that these can be, well, 3 ways, that these vertical doors, and there were horizontal and vertical oriented watertight doors on board, but the ones at the bottom of the ship were all vertical oriented. They can be closed automatically from the bridge with a lever that Officer Murdoch activated shortly after the collision, which sounded these warning bells, and then all of the doors simultaneously came down, all the way moving aft. Or they can be closed automatically in contact with water, and probably these 2 doors closed that way the moment of impact, because water also started coming up through the double bottom, the hull of the ship, and there's this plunger here. And if water reaches this, it would lift up and move this actuator lever, which then rings the warning bell and releases the door, which in standard operating procedure, this would have been up, like this one. And when that mechanism releases, gravity brings the door down and it seals. Now, even if someone's in this vestibule, and you may be thinking, well, there's a door there and a door there, so how do you get out if they both automatically close? Well, there is this hatch. I don't know precisely where that goes. But there's also this escape ladder. There's a hatch at the top, so you can seal it as well from up there in the event that water's coming up it, but this would be how anyone in this vestibule could get out. And then in the boiler rooms themselves, there's all these catwalks, and these stairs go all the way up the fiddly vent to the number 1 funnel. So you can get all the way topside from the boiler room. So no matter where you are, once the watertight door is closed, you can still get out. No one was trapped. In the movie, you see this race to get under the doors, but in actuality, that wouldn't have been necessary. You could still escape, no matter what. You've got steam venting off of this valve thingy. It's a very technical term, that is. And here, this is a wheelbarrow. It appears to be recently, at least, full of ash from one of the furnaces. And this is the forwardmost boiler room on board, boiler room number 6. So these furnaces are lit, so this would have been what's causing the smoke venting out of the funnels upstairs there. And one thing that's interesting about this particular version is we can actually go into all of the, well, at least all of the accessible coal bunkers at this point. And this one appears to be, as you can climb on all of this coal. Normally, I don't know how well illuminated these would have been. They may have, because you see these are all portable lamps there. The trimmers would be the ones bringing wheelbarrows in here and bringing coal, excuse me, out to the floor of the stokehold, and then the stokers who have shovels and they're out here, they would just be shoveling coal into the furnaces. That was their only job. It was extraordinarily warm down here. Usually well over 100 degrees, sometimes soaring over 120 degrees. So the men working down here, they were stripped to the waist and had relatively short shifts in order to make sure that people weren't dying of heat stroke. But this would be how they would indicate the condition of the ship. Really, all that the boiler rooms needed to know was if we were going, if we weren't, or if it was half ahead. Because the way they could try to manage steam pressure moving aft into the engine rooms was if they needed to truly come to an all stop, they just slam the dampers with these chains here that are hanging down. You pull that, and this closes and stops air flowing over the coals. And once that happens, steam pressure immediately begins dropping. I don't know if we have an indicator anywhere in here. There it is. On each furnace, it appears there's a steam pressure indicator. And if it was all stopped, you want to get that below a certain point. Or half ahead, there's a certain steam pressure level. And they could monitor some of that by basically managing how many furnaces they have operating and whatnot. Moving aft, though, to the aft side of boiler room number 6, which again is the furthest forward, I'm going to check this coal bunker as well, because sometimes there's interesting things. This one appears to be almost entirely empty. So we get sort of a view of what an empty coal bunker was like. You can see there's catwalks and things. I don't think we can climb this. Nope. So we'll get back out of here. So the aft end of this is fairly similar to the forward. I'm just going to check this side as well. I'm looking for something specific here. Oh, we can climb up the coal. So that's kind of fun, I suppose. I don't know. Let's see. Ah, okay, so we're now sort of on the upper catwalk. Whoops. Let's try that again. Of one of the coal bunkers in Boiler Room 6, and you can see all the way across. So this upper level would span both sides, whereas the fireman's tunnel passes underneath along the center line. So at the bottom, there it's separated into two bunkers, but it's actually one. And you can see sort of, I think that's forward direction there. Yeah, I don't know how much you'd actually be able to see in here. It would probably be rather dark. Climbing back down this mountain of coal here, you can see how it would be a very dangerous environment to work. And moving further aft, boiler room number 5 is also included. So there's more furnaces lit in here. And this is the coal bunker for boiler room number 5. Now this is important that you can see there's a little smoldering going on in here. This is the infamous coal fire. There is a theory doing the rounds online that there was a coal bunker fire that sank the ship. And the way that this happened was that there was a blazing inferno in one of the coal bunkers, and it warped the starboard side exterior bulkhead that impacted the iceberg, and somehow that weakened the steel. As you can see, this is not a particularly impressive fire. There's no giant flames and no raging inferno that the crew was battling for days. It's just sort of a smoldering coal fire that was not uncommon on ships of the era, on coal-powered ships. What the standard procedure was is you would just move the coal that surrounded it to one of the other bunkers that wasn't burning. And then you would let this little bit of coal burn out. And this is not an exterior bulkhead. This is a bulkhead in between this coal bunker and boiler room 6. And the exterior of the ship is way over here. Plus, the iceberg impacted forward on the starboard side. In fact, I can show you precisely where that would have been. Oops. The iceberg impact was on the starboard side right here. So this would have been, yeah, this would have been where the iceberg struck. Or I guess they struck the iceberg. Yeah, this portion of the hull. Because boiler room 6 and I believe the coal bunker here and the coal bunker here were all directly breached. And then perhaps, because I think boiler room 5 did begin to flood as well, that it was actually the double bottom that was breached from underneath, and it started flooding the stokehold that way as well. And then we can look aft. But yeah, the coal fire theory does not structurally make any sense. There's no way that a fire in where it was would have led to the issues that were proclaimed. Excuse me. So this is one of the coal bunker chutes closed, in its closed position, to sort of hold back the coal, because you can see these furnaces are not lit, or at least their dampers are shut. There's actually some glowing going on in there, so they do appear to be lit, but they're in the process of extinguishing. They would occasionally open the dampers and rake out the fires and that kind of thing. So you can go further aft a little bit and look into boiler room 4. It's through the fireman's passage all the way aft. But this is as far as we can go at the moment. We can, however, look sort of in some of these catwalks and things, some of the upper spaces of the boiler rooms. Now, these uptake casings that go up into the funnels, these would be extraordinarily hot. You wouldn't want to touch them, which makes it all the crazier that you have to duck and weave among all of this equipment. Because everything, especially once you're up here above the boilers, because heat rises, so this would not be a comfortable place to work, and touching even these handrails would not be good. You have to crouch to get under all of these steel beams and things. So it would be very uncomfortable. You can see there's hot steam venting places and whatnot, so very dangerous place to work. And then going all the way up, well, actually what we can do is, so there's these mount points for steam pipes and things that would exhaust all of that to various parts of the ship. And then up here, you see I have to crouch in order to get into any of this. I don't remember if it's this one or one of the others, but must be one of the others. These very, very tight ladders going upwards, and those lead to access points where you can maintain some of those steam vents and things. There's multiple of these at various points. And I'm looking for one in particular that allows us to comment on how excess ash was dealt with on board. So once the coal fires had burned down and the coal was no longer usable because it had burned to essentially dust, you would have to get rid of it somehow. And even then, they realized that dumping ash, particularly in a port, was a bad idea because that would cause issues. So what they did to try to accommodate some of that, and I'm going to go up this catwalk here to see if I can find what I'm looking for. Yeah, this is up the fiddly vent here. This is not what I'm looking for, but it does allow. So there's various platforms and things, water tanks, and other things of that nature. We can climb pretty much all the way up to... Yeah, that's a view all the way up to what I believe is the forward funnel. So there's fiddly vents, catwalks going all the way up. Daylight pouring down. The uptake casings sort of cover most of that, so you can't see daylight down in the stokehold itself, unfortunately, but it is what it is, I suppose. Let's find a ladder down here. There's one. We'll go into the forward boiler room again to see if I can find the ash place. Because the ash place is a very strange little room. Oops, wrong direction. Where they would hoist some of that unused material and take it away from the stokehold and then store it until they basically had something to do with it. Let's see here. I think it's the aft side of boiler room 6 that has this. This one? Do not remember. Nope. We'll try the other side again. More steam pipes and things to duck and weave around. Access to the fiddly vents. I think it must be this one then. Yep. So I got the weird dawdling looking for things, but up this way is the ash place. So they would hoist excess ash, and you can see there's ash all over the deck here, into this weird little room. There's the buckets for the ash, and there's ash all over the place. And they just store it in here. Here's the mechanism for the hoist. Until there was a suitable time to ship it over the side. And this is the actual bucket hoist. On the other side of this door is a lavatory for second-class stewards, weirdly enough. I don't know why they needed an access door there for this, but they did. And then this is a hatch into the side of the ship where they could then remove all of this ash at presumably when they have tied up in a port. And we can actually use this bucket hoist as an easy access back down. You wouldn't want to do that normally. That would not be fun. You'd break your legs. But here's a bucket full of ash, ready to be hoisted up. We will head back to the fireman's stairs, because we can go up to E deck. I believe... And actually, we may need to go up to Scotland Road and use the cruise passage to get to some of the other spaces. Oops. This is the thing, is this ship is a maze. So, I definitely don't know necessarily off the top of my head a lot of the easiest ways to get places. We'll see if this is... I believe this will work. Yep. So this door will take us to the cruise passage. Wait for this loading screen here to take us where we need to go. This one appears to be a little bit longer. Here we are. Alright, so this is the cruise passage. There's a handful of spaces that are important here, but notably, this is the lavatory I was just talking about when we were in the Ash Place. This is a steward's lavatory. Standard for most bathrooms on board, although the ones for ladies, for stewardesses or female passengers, would not have urinals. But other than that, this was standard for pretty much everything except first class, which had a little bit different arrangement, but not dramatically different. There weren't a whole lot of ensuite bathrooms on board in specific cabins. They were primarily these public bathroom plans. And then here is the standard toilet on board. This stall open. I forget the manufacturer that made them. It was not the Thomas Crapper Company. They did not. They did not manufacture the toilets on board. But through this weird-sized door is the Ash Place. Again, I don't know why there's an access door to the Ash Place from this random bathroom on E deck, but there it is. This is the black lino tile pattern that is common for crew spaces. Red was also in crew spaces, but red predominantly meant second class, and then green was for third. So this is the crew passage. It's not all the way straight, so you can't really see the ship's full length, but it does run nearly all of the ship's length. And then that's the door we just came out of from the number 5 boiler room. Now, let's see. Steward's quarters, those are going to be slightly down the hallway here. So the steward's lavatory that we were just in, there's all sorts of bunk rooms on this deck, but this is for particularly second-class stewards. This is their dormitory. I'm not going to call it a cabin, because it isn't really. There's a lot of men in here, and this was affectionately referred to at the time by the crew, as well as other stewards' cabins or dormitories, glory holes. I don't know precisely why, and I take it meant something different at the time. Anyway, so the cruise passage takes you to various spots. This is also used by third-class passengers. So we're going to sort of pass directly by the third-class dining saloon and a couple of other third-class spaces in order to... Because that's those stairs there, those go down to the third-class dining saloon. But this is useful because the watertight doors, the horizontally operable watertight doors, there's a crank in this little wooden box on the wall here, and there's the panel watertight door deck plate down. So there's this little circle with a hole in it. You would take the crank out of the box, insert it into here, and then you could crank the horizontal doors closed. And there's an example of that over here. You see those horizontal brass gear tracks coming up in the distance there. This is a horizontal watertight door. So just like that panel we just passed, there's one on the deck above. And that little hole, you'd insert the crank into the hole, and then that turns this. And you can see the gear on its track here, and this whole thing would then close. You can see the manufacturing stamp in the steel beams there. So that's sort of the level of detail that's found throughout this program here. We can keep heading aft. This is predominantly, I believe, crew spaces, but there could be alternative third-class cabins in here as well. But through here is the engineer's mess. So as you can see, this is a little bit nicer than the mess halls we passed earlier for sailors and the various boiler room crew member departments. I think electricians and some of them would also dine in here, and there was a team of stewards assigned to this room to service the engineers, because they were effectively officers. The chief engineer was of a similar rank to some of the deck officers that were in the officers' deck house earlier. He was not bunked up there, he had a cabin downstairs, but it would have been a similar room to this. There's King George, and then there's another portrait over here I can point out. Thomas Ismay. So J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line at the time of the Titanic's maiden voyage, this was his father, who effectively founded the passenger company, White Star Line, Ismay, Imrie, and Company. He purchased a sailing packet company called White Star and basically turned it into the company that we know that operated Titanic. White Star the name still carries on, despite White Star's merger with their rival, their British rival, Cunard, in the 30s, under the mandate of the British government as a bailout during the Great Depression. The White Star service that you can find on Cunard ocean liners today, they still operate an ocean liner or two, Queen Mary 2 as a permanent ocean liner, and 2 cruise ships as alternative transatlantic ocean liners occasionally. The White Star Service Department, Hospitality Department, is named after the White Star Line. So, through here is the turbine engine room. So, the way that Titanic's propulsion system was laid out, there were 3 propellers on board, one mounted on the center line just forward of the rudder, and 2 on wing propeller shafts, sort of almost outside of the ship, port and starboard. And the center propeller was operated by steam turbines, and this engine room here is for those turbines. We can't go all the way down. I think I can only climb another ladder or 2. Yeah, this is as far down as we can go. But this is the upper part of those turbine engines. It would be extremely loud in here, but there's no sound in this demo. I just have some of Honor and Glory's original soundtrack playing over the top of everything. But this sort of gives an overview of what the upper levels of the turbine room may have looked like. We don't know for absolute certain. This is an educated guess based on Olympic and other ships of the era. In terms of some of the coloring and precise arrangements, we know what the turbine engine looked like because we have photos of Olympics and Britannics prior to installation, but I don't know precisely what this is. It's a storage space, but there's that. Behind a grate, which is kind of interesting. It's like they have the engine rooms behind bars. And up there is the fiddly vent for the turbine casing going all the way up topside. We passed already the reciprocating engine room, which is where I believe we shall end our portion of Titanic tour today. This is the reciprocating engine room, the largest triple expansion reciprocating engines at sea at the time. You can see daylight pouring down the fiddly vent there. Excuse me. We can climb down some of these ladders here to get a better look at the engines. They are functioning at the moment, which is indeed rather neat. There are a few ships still Well, there's only a few examples of reciprocating engines still in existence, let alone in operable condition. So this is definitely an era of engineering that is pretty much gone. But this allows to show, so the engine control platform is right here. That's sort of where the chief engineer and his deputies would work. And right here are the terminal point of the engine telegraphs we saw yesterday in yesterday's tour. So the bridge would send a command down here, and it would indicate on this panel, and then the engineers would then make the engines do whatever it was that they needed, and acknowledge the order from their end of that unit. Send a message back to the bridge. Yep, we got it. We got it covered. But this is the one side of the reciprocating engines. There's two. They're both basically cathedral-sized pieces of equipment, generating a lot of thrust. And then the actual propeller shaft passes that way towards the propellers. But this is the reciprocating engine room. There's the terminus of the telephone circuits over here as well, to various other parts of the ship. Turbine engine room, boiler rooms, the bridge, and the like. There we have it. That is, I think, where we shall end today's video. That has been a tour of the crew spaces, the general crew spaces of the RMS Titanic. Hopefully it was at least somewhat interesting or informative in that regard. Let me know if there's anything I can do to improve some of that, but that, I think, is where we will leave it. Tomorrow we will move on to third-class passenger spaces. We passed through the third-class passage, which is also Scotland Road, the cruise passage. I think I forgot to mention, Scotland Road is named after a street in Liverpool where most of Titanic's crew, most of White Star Line early crew members from the 19th century would have lived. A street in Liverpool, but the name carried over to White Star Line ships throughout the era, including the Olympic class and Titanic here. And that passage was both for crew and passengers. But again, that's, I think, where we'll leave it. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you, I think, tomorrow, back up on Scotland Road.